Hello, everybody. It's Achilles Justice here with the Philosophy Society. It is April 16th, 2024. It's a Tuesday. And we're at the Toronto Metropolitan University Student Learning Center, room 726. And we have people in the room, people online, people in the future, which will be there present on YouTube. And so we are continuing our reading of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. We're on the second part today, which is the overview. And that in this copy goes from page 46 until page 70. And so my general format for doing this is I have some slides that are relatively basic, and I'll read those first, and then I'm going to go through the text a bit more meticulously and then take little breaks and philosophize some parts. This is a self-help book. I think it's important, or a personal development book. I think it's important to acknowledge that. It is not in the philosophy canon, but there is wisdom in this book, and wisdom for our well-being, or eudaimonia. And so I think that some areas as an analytic philosopher that would need some conceptual clarity is, what is the relationship between values, principles, and habits? I don't think that Stephen Covey really defines these as well as it could be done. And how do we operationalize these terms so that we can see them in the world and measure them if we were going to be psychologists in this context as well? I think these are two areas that we could do a little bit of work here and make this information even more robust or useful. It is very useful though. Like even though there are some things that philosophically might be unclear or ambiguous, we can gain a lot of insight and pragmatic utility from using this book. And so that's why we go through it. And principles, again, are, so there's reality, and then there's like language, right? And we map language on reality. And sometimes when we simplify parts of reality, like there's different parts, there's like water, and there's like, and then there's mathematics, and then there's like, human relations, or just like the human condition. The human condition is within the context of like time, for example, or like decision-making, or the fact that we have behavior, i.e. habits. And so these principles are relative to that. That's the principles he's talking about. And when we make these principles into an actionable behavior over time that becomes automatic, that's in some ways a habit. And so one of the problems that I would raise as a psychologist in this chapter is his definition of habit. There are some problems there. His definition of habit, this is like a general overview of the chapter before we go into it, is almost intentional habit. But we have habits that we perform that are not intentional, that we may not even want to do. For example, if somebody has like a weird twitch, or whatever, they may not know that they're doing it. They have no skill involved, and they don't have any desire. They're like, I wish I never did that, but it's still a habit, right? Or smoking, there may be some ambivalence about the desire to smoke. There's a craving, and they don't want it, like they desire to want it and not to want it. So those are two examples of habits that don't fall within the conceptual definition, or the properties that he outlines as the definition of habit. But the way that he's defining habit is like, it's easier to understand it as an intentional kind of set of behaviors, right? But really any form of automatic behavior that is a pattern, we could kind of call a habit, and some of those habits may be good, some of them may be intentional, but those are different things, right? And so part of this as an underlying assumption, which he'll get to in the next chapter, is the notion of being proactive, is making a decision about what kinds of habits we're going to mold. Okay, so this is the overview section, as I said before. And so these are the general principles that we're going to find. These, sorry about the page numbers, they're not actually correct here. This is for the 25th anniversary edition. We're changing the edition here. the page numbers start on page 46, actually. Anyways, so the first principle is a misquote by Aristotle. Many philosophers will be very upset when they read this because Aristotle didn't actually say this. This is Stephen Covey's paraphrasing of Aristotle. And so he says, what we are, or what we repeatedly do, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. That's actually Stephen Covey saying that. It's not Aristotle. It is, he most likely derived this from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics or Eudemidian Ethics and kind of summarized his version of what that means. And so, unfortunately, that is academics will not like that very much. And it's whatever, it's a misquote. But you can derive that a little bit from Aristotle. We could say that Aristotle's theory of practical wisdom, applying virtues within specific situations over time, will make you a virtuous person. That's more in line with what Aristotle says. So he says, true independence of character empowers us to act rather than be acted upon. It frees us from our dependence on circumstances. So he talks about this maturity continuum that we go from dependence, independence to interdependence. And so that's the jump from dependence to independence, is that we are being proactive, is what he's talking about here. And then the interdependence is a choice only independent people can make. He's saying that if you're dependent, you can't really cooperate with people. You're not at that point in your life. And so interdependence, and we'll talk about that more when we get there, is the goal, because he's writing this also from the position of a consultant for organizations, right? He says true effectiveness is a function of two things: what is produced, the golden eggs, and the producing asset or capability to produce, the goose. So later in this chapter, we're going to get to his analogy of the goose and the golden egg. And what he's talking about is production and production capability, that we can't just focus on the results. We have to focus on the thing that's creating those results in the first place. And so we'll go through that. Always treat your employees exactly as you want them to treat your best customers. This is like a general principle that, like, sometimes people will perceive their employees as slaves or a means to an end, that they can just use them, that they pay them and they have to do whatever they want. But at the end of the day, the employee does volunteer to be there. They do make a decision, right? And just like the customer volunteers to give their money to you. No one can persuade another to change. Each of us guards the gate of change that can only be opened from the inside. Marilyn Ferguson. And so this is a principle that he kind of, at the end of the chapter, really founds his ideas on, that you have to that motivation comes from within and you can't coerce people to do things. Then one of the last things he talks about is, you are not your habits. You can replace old patterns of self-defeating behavior with new patterns, new habits of effectiveness, happiness, and trust-based relationships. So that's generally, you could say in some ways, the main idea of the whole book, that you want to be in control of effective habits for your life. And that's why it goes to well-being. And I think it's important when we talk about practical philosophy, like what is wise for us to do and how do we live by these wise ideas. So the first section is about character. So I'm going to open up the book now, and we're on page 46. So we can see the 7 habits in overview. And at the top here, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit, Aristotle. Again, that's a misquote by Aristotle. I would challenge Stephen Covey or any of his individuals that work with him or for him after he passed to point out where in Aristotle that comes from. And I think that it was a paraphrasing of the Nicomachean Ethics and or Eudemidian Ethics. So he says at the beginning, our character basically is a composite of our habits. He is making an argument of free will. And on one side, we can say that there's the deterministic argument, and he's adamantly against that. He wants us to be in control of our lives and to make decisions towards some value or goal that we have in mind. And the way that we get there is through, to be effective, to be successful, is through habits And your character, he would argue, is a representation of your habits over time. And so he says, habits are powerful factors in our lives. They are consistent, often unconscious patterns. They constantly, daily express our character and produce our effectiveness or ineffectiveness. And so he gives this analogy that habits are like a cable, that when we weave it together, eventually it can't be broken. And he says, well, no, it's not 100% true. Some habits are good for us, and the ones that are bad, we want to unlearn those habits, like addictions, for example. And so he says that he wants to step away from the quick fix mentality, that fundamentally, we can argue living a good life or being effective is a process of consistent commitment. We always have to be working on it. And so the next thing he talks about on page 46 is an analogy to Apollo 11, the first time that humans walked on the moon. And he said, astronauts literally had to break out of the tremendous gravity pull of the Earth. More energy was spent in the first few minutes of liftoff or in the first few miles of travel than was used over the next several days to travel 500,000 miles. He says, habits too have tremendous gravity pull, breaking deeply embedded habitual tendencies such as procrastination, impatience, criticalness, or selfishness that violate basic principles of human effectiveness involves more than a little willpower and a few minor changes in our lives. Liftoff, going back to the leaving the atmosphere analogy, takes a tremendous effort, but once we break out of the gravity pull, our freedom takes a whole new dimension. Like any natural force, gravity pull can work with us or against us. The gravity pull of some of our habits may currently be keeping us from going where we want to go. It is also gravity pull that keeps our world together, that keeps the planets in orbit and our universe in order. It's a powerful force. If we use it effectively, we can use the gravity pull of habit to create a cohesiveness and order necessary to establish effectiveness in our lives. One of the greatest parts of the human condition is that, our brains have evolved the capacity via neuroplasticity to develop habits, that once we learn a thing, it can become automatic and we don't have to exercise conscious control over that habit. And that's really useful, right? There is some deterioration over time, or if you don't use that for a while, you can kind of lose the skill. And there are different categories of habits based on memory, or, like there's semantic memory, there's episodic memory, and then there's like motor memory, and so each one is going to have its own variance and how it deteriorates over time. But fundamentally, like, this also goes back to the human condition. And so look at our slide here. Our character is a composite of our habits. Habits are consistent unconscious patterns expressing our character to produce effectiveness. They can be learned or unlearned. We have our example of Apollo 11. And we want to use the pull of habits to create a cohesive lifestyle that is ordered, right? So now the next section on page 47, habits defined. So I'll just read the slide first, and I'll go to the book. So here he talks about, he defines habits as the intersection of knowledge, skill, and desire. Now, again, I'm going to say that this is a definition of intentional habit, because we can have habits that we don't like a weird twitch or a tick, or some social behavior that we're not even aware of, that we don't have knowledge of. There is no skill, and we're not motivated. So that, as a counterexample, would defeat this definition. So what we can do is we can just redefine it to meet the criteria. And so one way we do that is just say it's intentional, right? Intentional is that you have some knowledge of what you're doing, there's some skill involved, and there's a desire to do it, right? And he says that effective interactions with others requires listening to them, right? You have to know how to do it, you have to want how to do it, and you have to have a desire to want to effectively interact with other people. And then if you practice that over time, it will become a habit. So let's look at the book here, page 47. For our purposes, we will define a habit as the intersection of knowledge, skill, and desire. Knowledge is a theoretical paradigm, the what to do, the why. Skill is the how to do. Desire is the motivation, the want to do. In order to make something a habit in our lives, we have to have all three. So I philosophized that a bit and said, well, it's not 100% true, but we're going to go with his thesis for now. So he gives some examples of how to work effectively with people at work, his partner, his spouse, and his kids. And he says, if you're in the situation where you just don't really listen to people, right? You're just kind of telling them what to do, or you're passively listening, you're not really being effective in that relationship. And so he says, to be effective in that relationship, that's where we're going to want to develop this active listening skill. He says, deeply listening to them. And then he goes through this criteria of knowledge, skill, and desire, and then saying that creating a habit of listening to people is going to require all three of these properties. And then he talks about the being, seeing, change. So this is the next slide, still on page 47. So he says that this is an upward spiral of growth, right? And that upward spiral of growth is going from dependence to independence to interdependence. So that's, in a lot of ways, it's a humanistic psychological evaluation, right? Abraham Maslow is another one that has a growth paradigm where he talks about the hierarchy of needs, right? And at the end of the hierarchy of needs is self-actualization. So in this growth paradigm, it's being interdependent. And again, a big part of Stephen Covey is he's writing this for organizations as well, because he's a consultant. So working on knowledge, skill, and desire can break old paradigms. So through our self-awareness, we can be aware of the way we see the world and how our knowledge, skill, and desire affect that. And the goal here is achieving personal, interpersonal effectiveness, change our motivation through some higher purpose, i.e. value or goal, and a willingness to subordinate present or future wants for, present for future wants. So whatever's going on now, we can let that go or suffer a little bit in the present so that we're happier in the future. And then he says this process produces happiness, which would equate that to well-being or eudaimonia again. That's the purpose of us doing this. That's the philosophy or the wisdom behind reading this book. And he says the fruit of desire and ability to sacrifice now for later. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So page 47, the being, seeing, change is an upward process. Being, changing, seeing, in turn changes being. So there's a reciprocal relationship here. The way I am and the way I see things. As we move in an upward spiral of growth, by working on my knowledge, skill, and desire, I can break through new levels of personal and interpersonal effectiveness by breaking old paradigms or old ways of seeing the world that have a source in a pseudo-security. So sometimes we just become familiar with things because our social group says that's the way it is, whether it's religious or cultural, or just personal. And that way of seeing things may be actually counterintuitive to our well-being. So it can be a painful process, this notion of change. And so if it's motivated by a higher purpose, the willingness to let go of what's going on now for something greater can be easier. We're on page 48 now. This process produces happiness, the object and design of our existence. So again, the word design here, he is religious in nature. He's Christian. So he has an assumption of God as the designer, but it's not necessarily the case. We could just say evolution, right? Human beings have evolved to have positive emotions because so we don't kill ourselves fundamentally. We have a motivation to keep on living. And that's a good thing. Happiness can be defined, in part at least, as the fruit of the desired ability to sacrifice what we want now for what we want eventually. Okay, so here you go. This is on page 48. And so he does a Venn diagram of knowledge, skill, and desire, and we have habits in the center. So again, I gave a counter argument for why that might not be the case. But if we just write intentional habit in there, I think it's going to satisfy properties that he's identifying. Or he says effective habits. See at the bottom? So that's a little different. Very similar. Internalized principles and patterns of behavior is how he describes that. Okay, so let's go back to the slide. Okay, so the next is the maturity continuum. So this is from page 48 to 53. So it's a few pages. So I'm going to read through this slide first, and then maybe I'll read through both of them. There's 2 slides here. So the 7 habits provide incremental, sequential, integrated approach to development of effectiveness. And so that's that maturity continuum, right? That we go from dependence to independence to interdependence. And he says all nature is interdependent. So he talks about the ecosystem, for example, right? It's all interwoven. And he says so philosophically, We can talk about systems theory, right? Or a mechanistic view of the universe, that it's a mechanism that all has this interdependent workings with itself. Dependence is a paradigm of you. You are responsible. Independence is a paradigm of I am responsible. Interdependence is a paradigm of we are responsible. Here's slide 2. Talks about emotional dependence. My security and worth comes from the opinions of others. Interdependence, our worth within ourselves, but also recognize the need and love from others. So he talked about self-mastery, which is habits 1 through 3. That's dependence to independence. And then he communicates about private victories. This is one of the major principles of the book, that, and it's the way that he's designed it. That's why this book is so interesting, because like we talked about in the foreword, it's like an operating system, like for a computer. But the way it's designed, just that in itself has a lot of wisdom in it, or philosophical rigor, because the private victories of the first 3 habits are necessary in the dependence to independence shift before you can have what he calls public victories, which are working with other people. Understanding the sequence helps manage growth effectively. And then lastly, habit 7 is renewal, a regular balanced renewal of basic dimensions of life, habit of continuous improvement, creating an upward spiral of growth. So you basically just go back to habit 1 and then do it all over again. Or back to the inside out approach, re-understand the notion of a paradigm shift, and then you work your way through the habits again. So, okay, we'll sit here for a second on this slide, and I'm going to, from page 48, the 7 habits are not a set of separate piecemeal psych-up formulas. In harmony with natural laws of growth, they provide an incremental, sequentially, highly integrated approach to the development of personal and interpersonal effectiveness. They progress one through the maturity continuum from dependence to independence to interdependence. So he communicates how we start out life. This is the human condition. As an infant, we're dependent on others. We wouldn't be able to survive without it, this dependency with other people. It's page 49. Over time, we become independent, physically, emotionally, mentally, financially, and we're able to take care of ourselves, and we become inner-directed and self-reliant. Page 49. As we continue to grow and mature, we become increasingly aware that all of nature is interdependent. There is an ecological system that governs nature, including society. And so there's this notion that we're not just alone, right? Fundamentally, our existence is relative to others. And even Heidegger talks about this. He talks about the they, that you never really exist on your own. You exist in the context of other people all the time. Our growth from infancy to adulthood is in accordance with the natural law. There's dimensions of growth. You can talk about our physical growth, our emotional, mental. So on the maturity continuum, dependence is the paradigm of you. You take care of me. You come through for me. You didn't come through. I blame you, etc. Independence is the paradigm of I can do it. I'm responsible. I'm self-reliant. I can choose. Interdependence is the paradigm of we can do it. We can cooperate. We combine our talents and abilities and create something greater. Dependent people need others to get what they want. Independent people can get what they want through their own effort. Interdependent people combine their efforts with the efforts of others to achieve the greatest success. So he talks about being physically dependent. We need others to help us. And he goes through these different properties. Okay, so page 50. He just goes through different examples of, so he says that basically, like, and again, this was written in the 80s, but the current social paradigm is focused on independence. That self-improvement makes independence the most important thing, as though it's more important than communicating, teamwork, and cooperation, as if they were lesser values. So this emphasis on independence is a reaction to dependence, where others would be controlling us, they define us, they use us, and they manipulate us. So he says, at least at the time he was writing this, interdependence is little understood. People can be independent and then they just become overly selfish, right? Let's just see if we're here. I think we're on this area. They'll leave their marriages, they'll abandon their children, they'll forego social responsibility because they want to be independent. And this has this notion of becoming liberated. You're asserting yourself. You're doing your own thing. And it really, he says, it reveals a more fundamental dependency that cannot be run away from because they are internal rather than external. Letting the weakness of other people ruin our emotional lives or feeling victimized by people and events that are out of our control. We may need to change our circumstances. The dependence problem is a personal maturity issue with little to do with circumstances. Even with better circumstances, immaturity and dependence often persist. True independence of character empowers us to act rather than be acted upon, frees us from our dependence on circumstances and other people, and is a worthy liberating goal, not the ultimate goal in effective living. Independent thinking alone is not suited to interdependent reality. So he's just going back to this is the way nature is, right? And we're part of nature. Therefore, we need to follow rules of nature, basically. This principle of interdependence. Independent people who do not have the maturity to think and act interdependently may be good individual producers, but they won't be good leaders or team players. So not coming from the paradigm of interdependence necessarily to succeed in marriage, family, or organizational reality. So those areas of your life will suffer if you do not learn the paradigm of interdependence, right? Life is, by nature, highly interdependent. Try to achieve maximum effectiveness through independence is like trying to play tennis with a golf club. It's not suited to the reality. Interdependence is far more mature, more advanced concept, page 51. So if you're physically interdependent, you're self-reliant and capable, but also realize that working together, we can accomplish more than you can do on your own. Emotionally interdependent, one has a great sense of self-worth, but they recognize they need love from others. And to be intellectually interdependent, we get our best thinking when we work together. Interdependent person has the opportunity to share deep, full, meaningful relationships with others, and they have a lot more resources when they work with other people. Interdependence is a choice only independent people can make. Dependent people cannot choose to become interdependent. They don't have the character to do it. They don't own enough of themselves. And so there's not a full, I think, justification for that actually here, but we understand what he's trying to say. I think analytically, you'd have to be a little bit more robust in your argument, but it's fine for now. So habits 1, 2, and 3 deal with self-mastery. The person moves from dependence to independence. These are the private victories, the essence of our character growth. So here's the major principle of this maturity continuum, that private victories precede public victories. You can't invert the process. So an analogy he gives is you can't harvest a crop before you plant it. You need to have an inside-out approach, right? So as you become independent, you're building the foundation for interdependence that you can work with others. So like one way to say it is that like, if I have my own independence, I have my own agency, and cooperation is fundamentally based on self-reliant agents. Whereas if you're a dependent, your agency is contingent on somebody else. That's different than an interdependent context, which is based on self-reliant agency. That's a different argument I'm making there, but it's what he's trying to say, right? That's more analytically sound if we're going to be philosophical here, right? There has to be something that distinguishes the two. What is the property? There is a property, right? It's where the agency comes from, right? So if my agency is contingent on other agency, that's what dependence is. I'm really not me. I'm me through you. Only when I am me on its own, then we can be a we together. That's what he's trying to say, right? So he says, again on 51, halfway through, as you become truly independent, the foundation for effective interdependence, the character base from which you can effectively work on the more personality-oriented public victories of teamwork, cooperation, communication, and habits 4, 5, and 6. You don't have to be perfect. So he says, okay, so he's just, in this paragraph, he's just trying to say, you know, you don't have to like perfect the first 3 habits before you go on to the next one. That's why he has habit 7, right? That you go back to the beginning and you do it all over again, right? You go through the first 3, get a sense of it. Then you go through the next 3, 4, 5, and 6, get a sense of it. Then you start at the beginning again, right? And once you've gone through it the first 6 times, or the first 6 habits, and then you do in habit 7, and you start at the beginning again, you'll have a better sense of what it means to be proactive, right? It's interesting because I've been mentioning this book for like 2 years now, right? Now you guys are in it. Like, literally, you guys are both in the book. All right. So as part of an interdependent world, you have to relate that to that world every day. So problems in our world, he says, are fundamentally chronic issues of our own character. The character is the cause. And how what you are impacts every interdependent interaction will help you to focus your efforts sequentially in harmony with the natural laws of growth. So he has a footnote here. Habit 7, the habit of renewal, is a regular, balanced renewal of the 4 basic dimensions of life. It circles and embodies all other habits. It doesn't define what these 4 dimensions of life are over here, which is fine. There's a continuous improvement that creates an upward spiral of growth, which is this maturity continuum. It lifts to a new understanding and living each of the habits as you come around them to progressively higher plane. Maybe he mentioned those 4 dimensions of life in the first chapter. I forget. It's fine. Okay, so there's a little diagram here. We're going to go back to our thing. I'm going to not present so you guys can see it. All right, so this is like his main diagram. Super happy time, right? So we can see dependence, independence, interdependence, the 3 first habits, the ladder of 3 habits, and then the circle is the renewal, habit 7. And so he refers to this diagram, or you can refer to it yourself very often to have a sense of what he's talking about visually, right? Okay, we're going to present again. Continuum here. The diagram that I just showed is a visual representation of the sequence and the interdependence of the 7 habits. So he uses this throughout the book in this sequential algorithm between the habits and the synergy of all of them together. How, in relating to each other, they create bold new forms of each other that add even more to their value. Each concept or habit will be highlighted as it's introduced. So he's just talking about how he's going to go through this stuff. Okay, next thing. So I'm going to read the slide, and then I'll go through the book. So effectiveness defined based on principles that bring maximum long-term beneficial results. Basis for a person's character, creating an empowering center of correct maps, which are paradigms for him. Effectively solve problems, maximize opportunities, continually learn, and integrate other principles. So he gives this concept of production capability. And he gives an analogy of the goose and the golden eggs. We'll go through that. Effectiveness is the balance between P and PC, production capability, production of desired results, and the production capability is the ability or the asset that produces those results. So he says the 7 habits are habits of effectiveness based on principles. They bring the maximum long-term beneficial results possible, become the basis of a person's character, creating an empowering center of correct maps from which an individual can effectively solve problems, maximize opportunities, and continually learn and integrate other principles in an upward spiral of growth. So I think philosophically, it's good to just pause for a second. What is character, first of all? And what is the relationship between habits to that character? So that's not, I don't think that's 100% accurate here, but what is a person's character? Another way to say it is, what is the relationship between character and identity? And it's fine though. The way he defines it is partly your paradigms and your habits build your character over time. And what he's trying to argue for is being intentional about that. Is saying, I choose this to be the case. And I'm going to focus my attention and my efforts on developing this kind of a character. They're habits of effectiveness because they're based on the paradigm of effectiveness that's in harmony with the natural law, which he calls the PPC balance. And a lot of people break themselves against this natural law. So Aesop's fable of the goose and the golden egg. So that's how he illuminates what this means. So he says, there's a poor farmer who one day discovers in his nest of his pet goose a glittering golden egg. The egg is pure gold. He becomes even more incredulous the following day when the experience is repeated. Day after day, he awakens to rush to the nest and find another golden egg. He becomes fabulously wealthy. All seems too good to be true. With his increasing wealth comes greed and impatience. Unable to wait a day after day for the golden eggs, the farmer decides he will kill the goose and get all of them at once. When he opens the goose, he finds it empty. There are no golden eggs. Now there's no way to get any more. The farmer has destroyed the goose that produced them. So he says within this fable is a natural law or a principle that is the basic definition of effectiveness. Most people see effectiveness from the golden egg paradigm. The more you produce, the more you do, the more effective you are. This is page 54 at the top. But true effectiveness is a function of two things: what is produced, the golden eggs, and the producing asset or capacity to produce, the goose. So he says, if you focus on only the golden eggs and neglect the goose, like maybe you don't feed it or something like that, the goose will die and you won't have any more golden eggs. It's only by taking care of the goose without focusing on eggs that you will be rewarded. So you have to take care of the goose to get the eggs. So effectiveness, page 54 at the top, lies in the balance, what he calls the PPC balance. P stands for production of desired results, the golden eggs. PC stands for production capability, the ability or asset that produces the golden eggs. So next section, page 54, 3 kinds of assets. So he talks about a physical asset, gives this example of a lawnmower, talks about a financial asset, our capacity to earn money, and a human asset, which he goes into his marriage, or the relationship between parents and their children. You can have an authoritarian or permissive style of parenting. And there's an example of this daughter cleaning her room, and she wants to go see Star Wars with him. So he goes through these, you see, there's 3 different examples of assets, right? So the physical asset, he bought this lawnmower and he just used it for like 2 years, right? And then eventually it broke. And in the end, it cost more effort and money to fix the thing than it would have cost just to do minor repairs throughout. And so because he didn't focus on investing in the production capability, the lawnmower didn't work anymore, and now there's no more, you couldn't produce anymore with it. And so this can happen with a whole bunch of different physical assets, right? We look at short-term returns or results, and then we can ruin that physical asset, whether it's a car, a computer, your washing machine, our body, the environment. So keeping P and PC in balance makes a tremendous difference in the effectiveness of physical assets. So next example, financial assets. So he talks about there's the difference between our principal and our interest. And so he says decreasing the principal will decrease how much interest or income you get. So if you have savings and you take away from your savings account, you're not going to get money based on those savings. So our most important financial asset is our capacity to earn. If we don't invest in improving our PC, we will limit our options. We're locked in the present situation, this is page 55, scared of our, our boss's opinion of us, and we lose our effectiveness. In the human era, the PPC balance is equally fundamental, but it's more important because people control physical and financial assets. So if you're in a marriage and you're only focused on the benefits of the marriage and you're not investing in the relationship, you can become insensitive and inconsiderate, neglecting little kindnesses and courtesies that keep the relationship together. And people can end up manipulating each other, focusing on their own needs, justifying things, looking for evidence to show how the other person's wrong. And then the love and richness within the marriage can deteriorate. Again, sometimes people may just not be good for each other. He, again, comes from a religious background where you're not allowed to get divorced. And it may not be representative of psychological evidence that shows what kind of relationships are successful. So he might be a little dogmatic in his views on marriage. However, I think there is still something to be said about our paradigm or our perspective on what a healthy relationship is and applying his principle of production capability. I think that's still important. It can still be useful, but not all relationships that would work for, right? So try that first. And if it's, again, appealing to his thesis, if it's not a win-win, if you're the only one working on this and it's just not working out, it might be better for you to find someone who you can cooperate with, right? Let's check this. Okay. So next relationship in the human domain, parents' relationship with their child. So kids are dependent and they're vulnerable. So it's easy to neglect the production capability, the training, the communicating, the relating, the listening. So reading this book with your kids would be PC work, right? It's easy to take advantage of them, manipulate them, get what you want because you're bigger and smarter and you're always right. So just tell them what to do. You can yell at them, intimidate them, insist it has to be done your way. So he says the golden egg is them doing things willingly and being happy with you, having a healthy relationship with your kids. And so you want your kids to grow up. If you don't work on the PC, they won't have an internal sense of standard or expectation because they were contingent on you coercing them to be disciplined and responsible. You weren't teaching them how to do things on their own, right? So he gives an example of authoritarian or permissive. Authoritarian is telling them what to do. Permissive is just letting them do whatever they want. And the third style is authoritative, where you communicate and reason with them. He doesn't actually say that here, but that's another style of parenting. So the golden egg mentality. So what sense of responsibility, self-discipline, confidence, and the ability to make good choices or achieve important goals is a child going to have a few years down the road? What about your relationship? When they reach their teenage years, their identity crisis, will they know from their experience with which you have taught them that you care about them and that they can be trusted and that they learn how to do things? Will the relationship between you be strong, page 56, through your communication and your influence? So he gives an example of wanting his daughter to clean her room. That's P, production, the golden egg. The production capability is the goose that produces the golden egg. So if you have PC and P and PC in balance, she'll clean the room cheerfully without being reminded. She's committed and has the discipline to stay with the commitment. If your paradigm is focused on production, on getting the room clean, you might find yourself nagging them to do it. You'll escalate your efforts by threatening or yelling. You desire to get the golden egg, undermine the health and welfare of the goose. So he gives an example of a PC experience, and he goes through this dialogue with her. And he's like, okay, this is like our night out, him and this specific kid that he has. He has multiple kids. And he's like, what do you want to do? She's like, I want to go see Star Wars, but I know that you don't like Star Wars. And he's like, well, if this is what you want to do, I'll do it. And then she's like, well, you just don't know why Star Wars is good. You don't understand the philosophy of the Jedi Knight training. And then his daughter's like, it's very similar to what you teach. You basically teach like Jedi Knight training in your own way. And then he says, she sat next to me and she gave me the paradigm, page 57. I became her student and the learner. I was able to see out of a new paradigm the whole way a Jedi Knight's basic philosophy and training was. The experience wasn't planned. There was a serendipitous fruit of a PC investment. The bonding was very satisfying. We enjoyed the golden eggs. She had fun. And it increased the relationship between them because he was able to listen to her and they were able to bond. Okay, so organizational PC. So he talks about physical assets within an organization. So now switching from like family life to the corporate stuff. And he does that throughout the book. So he talks about an example of a machine with no downtime or maintenance, just focusing on production, and clam chowder. So when people fail to respect the PC balance and their use of physical assets in organizations, they decrease organizational effectiveness and often leave others with dying geese, going back to his example. So he talks about a person in charge of a physical asset like a machine. And this person wants to make a good impression on the superior. So they just produce as much as they can. There's no downtime. They just have the machine running day and night and they make a bunch of money. So, and then this person gets promoted. They get golden eggs. And then you take the job. Now, you're working with this machine. However, the machine has been used to the point where it's rusted and it's breaking down. So now you have to spend all your time maintaining the thing and fixing it. So it costs more money and your profits go down and you get blamed for the loss of production. But the problem was that the person before you liquidated the asset. However, the accounting system only reports production, the costs and the profit, right? And so it will just look at how much this person produced, how much this person produced. He says, the PPC balance is particularly important as it applies to the human assets within an organization, the customers and the employees. So he gives this example of a restaurant. They serve this really good clam chowder and they have customers all the time at lunchtime. The business eventually got sold and the new owner, page 58, focused only on production. They wanted to make as much money as possible. So they watered down the chowder. For about a month, the costs went down and they made a bunch of profit. However, little by little, customers stopped coming. Trust was gone and business dwindled to almost nothing. The new owner, quoting here 58, tried desperately to reclaim it, but he had neglected the customers, violated their trust, and lost the assets of customer loyalty. There was no more goose to produce the golden egg. So he says, organizations that talk a lot about a customer and completely neglect the people that deal with the customer, the employees. This is the next section. The PC principle is to always treat your employees exactly as you want them to treat your best customers. And he gives a quote here: "You can buy a person's hand, but you can't buy his heart. His heart is where his enthusiasm, his loyalty is. You can buy his back, but you can't buy his brain. That's where his creativity is, his ingenuity, his resourcefulness. PC work is treating employees as volunteers, just as you treat the customers." So he talks about this consulting situation he was at, and somebody said, "Well, how do you deal with lazy and incompetent employees?" And they give this paradigm of ship up or ship out as a supervision approach. Another person asked, "Well, who picks up the pieces?" "Well, why don't you treat your customers this way?" Someone else responds, "If you're not interested in buying, then just get out of here." He's like, "You can't do that to customers. Then how can you do it to employees as well? They're in your employ. Are your employees devoted to you? Do they work hard? How's the turnover?" The person responds, "You can't find good people. There's too much turnover, absenteeism, moonlighting. People just don't care." Well, maybe it's because of how you're treating them, right? There's a focus on the golden eggs. The attitude, the paradigm is to totally inadequate to tap into the powerful energies of the mind and the heart of the other person. 59. Short-term bottom line is important, but it's not all important. Effectiveness lies in the balance. Excessive focus on P results in ruined health, worn-out machines, depleted bank accounts, and broken relationships. Too much focus on PC is like a person who runs 3 or 4 hours a day, bragging about the extra 10 years of life it creates, but they're spending all that time running. Next paragraph: to maintain the PC balance, the balance between the golden egg production and the health and welfare of the goose production capability, it's often difficult judgment call. See, but he says it's the very essence of effectiveness. It balances short term with the long term and a bunch of other things. It's a principle that we can see validated in our own life. However, when you burn the candle at both ends to get more golden eggs, you end up exhausted and you can't produce anything at all. He talks about how this applies to relationships, how it's important to work together and to communicate, and you'll make large leaps in your growth when you focus on the PC balance. And he says it's valid in every area of life. The PC balance is the lighthouse, as we talked about in the previous chapter. And so now he talks about how to use the book. Okay, so I'm going to read from the slide quickly. The first paradigm shift is the material is not seen as a book, but a companion to a continual process of growth and change that is organized incrementally. So it's like an algorithm. You have to do the first step to make the second step more effective. The second paradigm shift is to take the role of a teacher with the material, not only to remember better, but it will help you expand your perspective. It will deepen your understanding and increase your motivation to apply the material. Okay, so page 59. So he does not want us to see the material as a book, but in a sense, something that you just read and put away again. Page 60. You can choose to read it completely through for the sense of the whole. The material is designed to be a companion to the continual process of change and growth. It's organized incrementally with suggestions for application at the end of each habit, so you can study and focus on a particular habit as you're ready. As you progress to deeper levels of understanding and implementation, you can go back again to the principles contained in each habit and work to expand your knowledge, skill, and desire. So one criticism of the book is the principles are not actually that explicit. I think if this book was rewritten, the way I did the slides was I listed the principles. And he just assumes in some ways, sometimes the way that he writes it is that the habit and the principle are the same thing, which contradicts what he says at the beginning of the book that they're not, right? And so I think it's important to identify what a habit is, an automatic behavior or behaviors we want to automate, and the principle that the habit is derived from. That would increase conceptual clarity within the book. And then the value that the principle is based on. I talked about this like last year in the springtime, the difference between habits, principles, and values. And that's not actually that clear in the book. When you read through the book, it gets muddled between them. And so that is one critique, that we could improve the clarity and the distinctness of what he's talking about if that was done. Okay, page 60. Second, shift your paradigm of your own involvement in this material from the role of learner to that of teacher. Take an inside-out approach and read with the purpose in mind of sharing or discussing what you learned with someone else within 48 hours of how you learned it. So in some ways, I'm doing that right now because I'm talking about it with you guys. But that's not 100% the purpose of this, but I think what he's saying is important. It is good for you to find someone to go through the book with because you'll learn much more. So if you can think of one person that would benefit, that you can spend time talking about with, that'll be good for both of you. So read through it as you're going to teach it. Notice the difference in your mental and emotional process when you come at it from the perspective of having to present the information. And that's really just a teaching strategy for all kinds of content, not just this. That's why they make you present stuff in school. If you approach the material each of the following chapters in this way, you will remember it better, but you'll have a different perspective when you read it, and it will be expanded. Your understanding deepened, and your motivation to apply the material increased. Openly, honestly share what you're learning with others. You'll be surprised to find that they'll have a better view of you. Okay, next part. So what can you expect? You're going to get increased self-confidence. You're going to know yourself in a deeper, more meaningful way. He could have put this at the beginning of the book as like a sales pitch. Yeah, your nature, your deepest values, and unique contribution capacity. Determine your self-worth from within, rather than by people's opinions or comparisons to others. So this is very good when it comes to David Burns stuff, right? You'll develop a changeless core within yourself. And then you can also heal and rebuild important relationships. So then he gives this quote by Marilyn Ferguson: "No one can persuade another to change. Each of us guards the gate of change that can only be opened from the inside. You cannot open the gate of another either by argument or emotional appeal." Well, I don't know about that. I think that is maybe wrong in some ways. That if I say something persuasive to you, that it makes sense, me saying it was the reason that you were like, oh yeah, that's true, right? If you're really nice to somebody, like sales is based on about emotional appeal. That people don't buy things or make decisions based on reason, they make it based on emotions. So, but what he's trying to say here with this quote is he's trying to respect the autonomy of other people. That somebody else, they have their own decision-making capacity, and we want to respect that decision-making capacity. So it's ethical in that sense. That's good. But I think it's wrong to demean being reasonable or demean or devalue the role of emotional appeal, because that's a big factor when it comes to how we make decisions. It's a huge factor, right? Like if you guys didn't feel good about being here, you wouldn't be here, right? And I am the main contributing factor to how you feel, right? Okay, page 61. If you decide to open your gate of change to really understand and live by the principles embodied in this book, a bunch of things, good things will happen. So this is like the willingness to have a paradigm shift is this gate of change, right? So he's talking about that too. Like, why would you even want to have a paradigm shift? You know, why would you be open to thinking about new things? Well, the first thing that's going to happen is if you're open to this stuff, is you're going to grow. Your growth will be evolutionary. He's just saying big. It's not actually evolution here. That's a misuse of the word. That's not what evolution is. Maybe revolutionary is fine. Okay, well, the net effect will be revolutionary. He used the word right there. The PC balance principle alone will transform most individuals and organizations. So that's cool. The net effect of the gate of change to the first three habits, the habit of private victory, will significantly increase our self-confidence. You'll come to know yourself in a deeper, more meaningful way, your nature, your deepest values, and your unique contribution to society. As you live your values, your sense of identity, integrity, control, and interdirectedness will infuse you with both exhilaration and peace. Okay, so this is cool. This is like his subjective, or maybe this is what he's seen people do, you know, when he works with them. You define yourself from within rather than by people's opinions or comparisons to others. So that's because he's saying that the inside-out approach is based on principles, the paradigms from which we view the world, instead of allowing others to define us. We're defining ourselves by our principles, fundamentally. As you care less about what others think of you, you'll care more about what others think of themselves and their worlds. So you'll see what their paradigms are, right? Not the labels that they're trying to throw at you. You'll no longer build your emotional life on other people's weaknesses. So this is good. This goes in line with the burn stuff that we talked about before. You'll find it easier and more desirable to change because there's something core deep within that is essentially changeless. And those, in some ways, are values, right? Or we talked before about axioms. But fundamentally, I think it's important to always have the second higher ordered self, the critical thinking self, to observe and analyze these principles or values and make sure that they're good, right? So the next three habits, the habits of public victory. You'll discover and unleash both the desire and the resources to heal and rebuild important relationships that have deteriorated or even broken. Good relationships will improve, become deeper, more solid, more creative, and more adventuresome. So that's cool. The seventh habit, if deeply internalized, renew the first six and will make you truly independent. and capable of effective interdependence. You charge your own battery. So you just like, it's important to not forget things fundamentally and have a robust understanding of what things mean. So he says, whatever your present situation, you are not your habits. You can replace old patterns of self-defeating behaviors with new patterns, new habits of effectiveness, happiness, and trust-based relationships. So if you really care, he wants you to open the gate of change, which is another way of saying paradigm shift, and growth as you study these habits. Be patient with yourself. Self-growth is tender. This is the self-help category, but it's also a wisdom thing. There's no greater investment than the self. Page 62. So this will be the end of the chapter of some editions, but our edition is going to continue. So it's obviously not a quick fix. You will feel the benefits and see the immediate payoffs. It gives a quote by Thomas Paine. That which we obtain too easily, we esteem too lightly. Dearness only, which gives everything to its value. And he makes a religious quote there. So basically he's just saying that anything that's meaningful, you have to put effort into it, which is good, right? Okay, so there's no more of this. So I'm just going to go back to, now you guys can just see me. So, okay, so now we have here, page 62 to 70 is what his son, Sean Covey, wrote. So I'm just going to go through this a little bit. I just don't have slides for it. So he talks about, this is very similar to like his daughter having the problem with sharing the presents in the previous chapter. His son had social anxiety. There's all these situations where his son was just, had difficulty with being in public around other people, with baseball, being in class. And at one point, Sean Covey, Stephen Covey's son, got upset with Stephen Covey's grandson, right? He like grabbed him by the arm and was like, stop it, stop behaving this way. And then he felt ashamed of himself, similar to how Stephen Covey was demanding his daughter share the presents. And then he reflected, page 63, Sean Covey reflected on himself and had a paradigm shift. He said, there was a special boy under all that anxiety. We needed to be patient with him, believe in him, and allow him to develop at his own pace. So very similar to what Stephen Covey said before. Slowly, his son began to change. A breakthrough came in 4th grade. He was asked to speak at school on habit 5. And his son said, I don't want to do that. Call them and tell them that I don't want to speak. They only asked me because you're the 7 habits guy. So it's funny in some ways thinking about Stephen Covey's family, because everybody is just in the shadow of Stephen Covey, right? Everyone just knows you as you're the guy who does the 7 Habits book, and that's who you are, right? And so he actually did the speech, his son, and then his son became super successful. By the time Nathan got into high school, he was one of the most outgoing, talkative, and confident kids you've ever met. His weakness became his strength. He went through so many challenges as a kid. Now he goes out of his way with loving compassion to help others who are struggling. Him and his wife saw Nathan's potential, we treated him differently, and that made all the difference, the power of a paradigm shift. So that's nice, right? And so paradigms are everything. If you want to make minor improvements, change your behavior. If you want to have, he uses the word quantum again, which is like, that's not what that word means. If you want to make big improvements or meaningful improvements, change your paradigm. So in their organization, Franklin Covey, they train millions of people in a bunch of organizations. They use this diagram. And then this is a Stephen Covey quote again, basically, what you see determines what you do determines what you get. When people, teams, and organizations, page 64, slowly work on the behaviors, they never get the results they seek. To get the great results, see, you didn't say quantum here, you used the word great, that's better. First, work on the paradigms. New behaviors don't stick unless you see differently. And that's why it's important to be philosophical in the sense that when you use pseudo-psychological terms to make something seem scientific, it actually reduces its integrity, right? And a lot of people that don't have like a solid academic background, because academics have to go through the peer review process, they will fall into that psychobabble mistake. And so there's no need. And so he just has this little diagram, little wheel here, right, of paradigms, behaviors, and results. And this goes from one to the other. And so he talks about his father. It says, live by principles. Each of the 7 habits are based on principles. And he gives an example, he gives another example. Here's this like, image of all these numbers. And he says, can you count from 1 to 54 within 60 seconds? And then he says, go to page, I don't know, is it 70? And he has an explanation there. And when you do it without this explanation, it's in some ways impossible to do it in 60 seconds. When you go to page 70, now that you have this little method, you can actually be successful in the task of counting these numbers. And he says the difference was that you had a method, an organizing model of some kind that helps you navigate. So our lives in general, page 66, there are so many choices and challenges. It's so easy to be lost or not very effective. And that's where the 7 habits come in. They provide an organizing model or way of thinking that can help you reach your goals and solve your problems better or faster. And in some ways, that's what wisdom really is, is a way to not make certain mistakes. That's, we would say, well, that was very wise of you. You didn't make that error, right? You didn't make that mistake. That was wise. And so that's why I think this book falls within the line of that. So once you have this model in your head, you'll never be the same, the 7 habits. Provides a pattern for creating a life of meaning and contribution. So we go back to the maturity continuum, where we start with the first 3 habits, which are private victories. Then we go to the public victories, 4, 5, and 6, and then we have the sharp and the soft. So he has another little diagram here of a tree, where at the bottom here is the first 3 habits, second habits, and fourth. So obviously buy the book, and then you guys can see it. It's cheap. It pays itself off. The $26 that this edition costs, like you spend money on things that are not good for you way more than this. And then there's the reading it too, obviously. So page 67, the tree diagram shows that the private victory habits are in the ground, signifying that they're personal and nobody sees them. They're like the roots of your character. The public victory habits are above the ground, like the leaves. Everyone can see them. And habit 7, the habit of renewal, is near the sun and the rain, which represent our need for constant nourishment. The 7 habits, the sequence matters. His dad realized when he was writing the book, he needed to start all over. He realized that he had to understand the importance of the sequence of the habits and needed to rewrite the book from that paradigm. The 7 habits are an inside-out approach. We have to win the private victory, habits 1 to 3, before we can win the public victory, habits 4 to 6. If you have a bad relationship with somebody, instead of trying to think win-win, it might be important to look at your own motivations first. Habit 2, begin with the end in mind. If it's not, sometimes it might be us that's the problem, not the other person. And the key to fixing the problem is guiding ourselves first. And again, but it might just be the other person actually. Like but don't just start blaming yourself all the time when it's somebody else's behavior. Remember Burns' 10th distortion. What is it? No, that's number 1. That's good though. Personalization, right? To blame ourselves for things that are out of our control, which is other people's behaviors and habits. I can change my perspective, but even at the beginning of the book, he says changing your attitude will just recolor a bad situation. If you communicate with somebody, like I have a relationship right now with somebody where I have communicated to them many times about simple things, like pick up your cigarettes. Don't leave cigarette butts all over the yard, right? And it's consistent. And it's not in my control. What's in my control is to communicate boundaries of responsibility. Please be responsible for yourself. And if you're independent, even an independent person wouldn't need to be reminded because they would do it on their own, right? And interdependence would be that me communicating it to you, you would be receptive to hearing that, right? But after you say it 30 times, right? Is it me that's the problem? Maybe. What else can I do? I spent $50 on ashtrays.
Flower pot.
Yeah, well, anyways. Okay, so it's important to know the sequence. And and so what he does on page 67 to 68 is he says that it's important to understand the habits is to know what they're not. So he's going to show us examples of where this is not what it is. So again, habit 1, the real habit is being proactive. So he says the 7 habits of highly ineffective people, habit 1 would be to be reactive. Blame everybody else for your problems. take no responsibility for your life and react, right? If you do that, you're not going to be very effective. Habit 2, don't begin with anything in mind. Don't have a plan at all, right? Don't plan ahead. Don't set goals. Don't worry about the consequences of your actions. Just go with the flow, live for the moment. Party on, dude. Tomorrow you may die. So that's like a YOLO philosophy, right? Page 68, the incorrect habit 3. So he says the real one is put first things first, like have priorities. And so he says, and the incorrect way is put first things last. So procrastinate. Do the urgent things first, like answering every phone call or whatever, or anything that comes your way. Get to the important stuff later. Don't worry about strengthening your relationships. Don't worry about exercising. Just spend your time watching YouTube all day. Habit 4, think, win, lose. The healthy, the effective habit is think, win, win. Here he says to think, win, lose is just see life as a vicious competition. Everyone's out to get you. Blame them for things. Don't let other people succeed. If they win, you lose. If it looks like you're going to lose, make sure you drag the other person down with you. So the correct habit, 5, is seek first to understand, then understood. Have empathy, right? The incorrect way is just talk first and then pretend to listen. You were born with a mouth, so use it. Talk a lot. Make sure everyone understands your views. If you must, pretend to listen by saying, while daydreaming. Or if you really want their opinion, give it to them. Habit 6, the correct one to be effective in this book, is to synergize, to work together and come up with things together. However, the ineffective way is just be on your own. Be an island, he says. This is Sean Covey, Stephen Covey's son. Other people are weird because they're different from you. So why try to get along with them? Teamwork is overrated. Cooperation slows everything down. You always have the best ideas. You're better off just doing things by yourself. Be your own special island. And then the correct habit for habit 7 is to sharpen the saw, which is the example of production capability. Here, the inefficient way is to burn yourself out. Be too busy living to take time to recharge and renew. Don't learn new things. And he's a bunch of other stuff. So he says, these are not habits we're after. Too often we practice them because they represent our course of least resistance. So in summary, he says the 7 habits gives you an unforgettable framework to navigate your life and become a more effective person at home and at work. He wants us to remember that private victories precede public victories. And he wants us to, he hopes he'll challenge and upgrade some of our old paradigms. And then he talks about what does his father think was the most important habit? He says every one of them is important. He says sometimes habit 2 is most important because if you don't have a vision for your life, you have nothing. Or habit 6, the ultimate habit, because when you practice all the other habits, you have arrived at synergy. Or habit 1, until you decide you're in charge, you can't practice any of the other habits. And then Sean Covey says, its most important habit is the one you're having the most difficulty with. And page 70, he gives the pattern to resolve that diagram of all the numbers. So he gives these numbers and asks you to count them. So I'm not going to tell you what that is because I want you to buy the book. Because I have to at least say that to respect the author. Okay. So that's the overview. So next week, we're going to go through habit 1, be proactive. In this edition, it starts from page 74 to 107. So that's like 40 pages. So we're going to do that. That's important. And yeah, and we'll get through this in like 2 months. If we do 1 chapter a week-ish. Okay, what do you guys think of that, the overview? Any ideas?
A good seed that's been planted for what to do, what not to do. Starts with the mentality, the belief system. You tell yourself your inner narrative. It's very important. Like I'm seeing a lot of similarities with Baby Birds.
Did you get to read any of it at all, or?
I know.
So start with that, and then you'll have more to say.
I'll have more understanding of it, but based on this chapter alone, it's a good intro.
At least you cracked the book open today.
Yes.
That's a win.
There's a great corn.
Natalia, you are up to date with reading, which
Yeah.
is nice to see. What do you think so far?
Yeah, I like the way how he said how first he showed us how to read the book.
Right? It's true. It's good.
Yeah, it makes sense. Because if you're about to present it right away, you'll remember better. Like, especially me. Yeah, I was trying to tell about it to my sister and my kid.
That's great.
It works.
That's great. And you can use Amazon to ship it to people. You can buy it for them and just send it to their house.
Amazon affiliate links.
There you go. Well, they have to buy it themselves, but yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, so how about we'll end it here, and then next week we'll do be proactive, the first habit. And yeah, very good.
Good.